Now let's specifically look at the metes and bounds in the state of Texas because it is a metes and bounds states. This is what we follow in terms of determining the boundary and reconstructing the boundary in the state of Texas. Where again in the public land states we use the rules of boundary construction for the BLM of reproducing sections, quarter sections, townships, and ranges. But in the metes and bounds, the words and deeds become quite important. The bounds or the boundaries are the points, lines, or the adjoiners. That's what a bounds is. The metes are the measurements, the distances, and the bearings. The bounds hold over the metes. So what is first looked at is the original monuments, and they're called artificial monuments. So for example, if you come to a point, the point references, say, two trees. These trees are artificial monuments that give references to the point. The point is the location, not the trees. If you go to this point and it says an axle and it has a distance to a tree and a distance to the tree, and the two trees don't line up to where the axle is, the axle holds. The trees are only used as references to put back the original monument. Now the artificial monument are typically things such as axles, rods, pins, posts, rock piles, mounds, things that we can go out there and locate. Artificial monuments fall only to natural monuments such as streams. So if you have a monument and a stream, the stream holds over the monuments. What does that mean? So imagine that I set four corners and I set corners to the banks of the stream, but I call for the stream. If the stream moves, the corners are no longer considered. They are only considered passing calls. And it is the stream or the meanders of the stream that is the holding boundary. But it's not the meanders. Typically they'll say to a stream and then along its meanders giving bearing and distances. It's not the meanders but the stream itself that holds. Now if you come to things where you pass a stream to get to a corner, the stream is not a boundary. You might have a distance that calls to a stream or to a draw. If the draw of the stream moves, it doesn't change the boundary because this is not considered a boundary. It's just a passing or a descriptive or not a locative call of a true boundary. If you come to a point at a stream and then away from that point, it is not the natural point. You didn't meander with the point. It's when the point becomes a bounding line the stream does, that it becomes important. The original bounds or original monuments hold, and they must be senior. So we have what's called vacant land, or land that might have not been patented from the state of Texas, and it's hard to determine who is the seniority. So it's not necessarily when it was patented, it's really when it was surveyed. And the survey date determines ownership. So let's say that you're going to buy a piece of property and you have a surveyor go out there on February 14th and survey that property, but you don't close and get the deed written until February 20th. The date of ownership is February 14th. Why? Because you set those monuments in the ground that date and you notified the public of that's when it became senior. So if you have some senior junior rights, that means that if somebody is senior around you, you would be junior here, and that their senior pieces need to be put into place before you, the junior. If, let's say, the senior over here for Jones was later resurveyed in 2018, and in that 2018 they called for Donald, the junior's corner here, the senior cannot elevate the junior over the senior. because later the junior here goes to find the corner, and they find the corner to be somewhere up here into Smith. They can't say, well, Jones said that's our corner, so now it must be that corner. A senior cannot elevate a junior just by calling them. They might be calling them out of a ability to just remove any ambiguity, saying these should be common corners, but not to give away title. So a senior cannot call to a junior and establish title. Okay, so the deed components, again, is the preamble, the grantor, the grantee, and the reference to the original reference instrument. Now again, even if it referenced the original reference instrument and any adjoiners, it doesn't necessarily say that that's going to hold. Now, when we do the land description or the legal description, also called the field notes, and it wasn't necessarily what was written out in the field, you must have a commencing point sometimes or a point of beginning. Now, a commencing point might say you're going to start way over here at a corner, come some distance, and then survey a track such as that. The commencing point over here, all right, is key, but it might not move the track, because if it goes some bearing in distance and it goes to an axle, to an axle, an axle, you go that commencing point and you fall short of that track, the axle still would hold. Then you have a point of beginning. So if you start at this point of beginning and you go around this track to this point, it doesn't really matter that that's the point of beginning, or that's the point of beginning, or that's the point of beginning. The point of beginning doesn't necessarily hold over any other points. It has no higher dignity than any other points. This has been settled in several court cases. So the adjoiners, the courses, the distances, the monuments, and even elevations. For example, if you said to a lake, if it is a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers lake, they typically set an elevation around the whole lake, setting the boundary. That might be a boundary that you need to know there. Then you'll have a closing call that says back to the point of beginning. Sometimes they'll start here, start here, start here, start here, and then say go back to the point of beginning, but they don't give that measurement because they might not have ever measured it. Then you have a quantity, meaning the area, and that's going to be the least of our area, our dignity, because if we go out there and we find something different, it's always the case. Sometimes when there is differences in areas, you'll see these they're hovered clauses, and it says more or less, save and except. Things such as that are put in there in the ends of the descriptions to try to say that the descriptions are more or less what they wanted them to be, but you need to go out there and maybe locate them to determine them. Then you have some postamble, which is typically signatures, things of that, other documents and information in that area. So in these legal descriptions, when you have that general description of the county, the state, the original survey, the section and township, any things like that, any size or particular tract, an abstract chain is available. They might give a lot of different information in the beginning, trying to describe where that piece of property is, and that general descriptions hold and is most important. But when we get to the specifics of going around and finding these tracks, again, those natural monuments of streams, those artificial monuments, those bearings, those distances, and then those areas will be the things that we consider next. Now, deeds can be of excess or deficiencies. What do we do if we have excess acreage? Now, if you have excess acreage, the question is, did you really have excess acreage? In other words, when the state gave you 640, you only were supposed to get 640. A lot of times the surveyors would add extra feet because it was such an abundance of land, and they would give you more land. Now, if that's the case, then the state has interest in the surface, and if they were severed, they might have interest in the mineral owners. House Bill 9 established what was called a deed of acquittance that said you must go get clear up any excess acreage. So if you had 1900 bars all the way around, which is a mile by a mile, but you go out there and you find additional acreage, the additional acreage does not lie in a certain place in the survey. It lies everywhere in the survey or the property, and it's considered that the state has a 5% vested interest in any of the economics of that property. So you would need to go get a deed of acquittance. But it needs to be clear, because if you went from an axle to an axle to an axle and an axle, and it still called for the 1900 bars, and you find those axles, then therefore there would not be excess acreage, because it called for the axles, you found the axles, and although you were supposed to get 640, the state accepted with those axles, and therefore you don't have excess acreage. You would not need to clear up with the deed of acquittance. In the oil and gas industry, when we are trying to put a bunch of these properties together, you'll find this quite common in the GIS aspect of things. Surveyors will typically draw and render their opinions of what they think they have the property to be. When you have areas that differ than what the document has, this becomes a big interest. Databases should have with the agreement, if you agreed upon 640 and these acreage in there, because if there is some additional acreage, again, we may have to set royalties aside till we figure that out, or if we feel like, okay, the additional acreage really is that landowner, it will be assigned, and then through the division order it will be actually applied. Okay, so there's a lot of information about excess acreage and the deed of acquittance and being familiar with that. Similar in other states, they have sections that do have additional acreage, and they are larger, so you might have to consider that. What causes it? Again, poor equipment. You know, the landowner assisted the surveyor and he actually added a foot every time. We find that most common. Excesses across the entire area, and if it is there, the state has a 5% financial interest to that. Now, in the state of Texas, let's describe an issue that goes on, is that we sometimes have what's called vacancies. Vacancies are tracts that really weren't fully called for, because in this example, somebody went through again and called for this piece, all right, and then they called for this piece, and they maybe meant to call there, but they never did, and it fell short, and there could be a small vacancy there. Those are called scraps, and they put them into the scrap file holdings from that portion. There was a big hunt. You had vacancy hunters that went through the 60s and 70s looking for all these and trying to get leases or trying to get agreements from the state to get the oil and gas leases, and the landowners thought, well, they own that. So to try to fix this, the state then said, well, really, the landowners have a good faith claim to it before maybe the oil and gas companies or anybody that finds these vacancies. So they put into a section of order to have the ability to purchase the vacancies. So if you're going to go after a vacancy, you need to get a surveyor, actually a licensed land surveyor, a LSLS in the state of Texas, which is different than RPLS, and apply for a good faith claimant to that vacancy, which you have the ability to do that. So when I'm looking for all these deeds, we have a lot of landmen, a lot of land brokers that go and pull all these deeds and change the title. They sometimes have to go to the general land office and get the original patents. It's always good to get all the information, maps. All these things are good evidence to help you to understand what goes on in that scenario. But you can go to appraisal districts, probate courts. There's other documents that may describe that piece of property, and you might need to look for those other documents. Searching online through databases always have success, but the actual document in my hand by the four corners rule is what I must follow.